Imagine waking up tomorrow. No shirt, no pants, no shoes, no jacket. And now imagine that everyone on Earth lives like this. No clothing stores, no cotton, no washing machines, no closets full of clothes. Nothing. For most of human history, clothes didn't exist. But today, wearing clothes is so normal that walking outside without them would seem completely ridiculous. So here's the strange question. Why did humans start wearing clothes in the first place? Was it because humans got cold? Was it to protect themselves from animals? Was it because someone thousands of years ago thought, you know what, I should make pants? Probably not. And here's where the story gets interesting. Scientists still don't know exactly when humans first started wearing clothes. Clothes are made from materials like animal skins, plants, and fibers. And unlike bones or stones, those materials usually don't survive for tens of thousands of years. So the first pair of clothes humans ever made is probably long gone. But scientists have found some fascinating clues. And those clues suggest that clothing may have appeared much earlier than you might think. Picture an early human living hundreds of thousands of years ago. No house, no supermarket, no heater, no modern technology. Just a human trying to survive. And unlike us, this human doesn't wake up and choose what to wear, because there is nothing to choose from. If it gets cold, they have a problem. If it rains, they have a problem. If they walk through thick plants, they have a problem. And if the sun gets extremely hot, you guessed it, another problem. But humans had one huge advantage: our brains. Instead of growing thick fur like many animals, humans could make things. A sharp stone could become a tool. A branch could become a weapon. Fire could provide heat. And eventually, something else could provide protection: clothing. But before humans could wear clothes, they had to figure out how to make them. And that was much harder than it sounds. Imagine an early human discovering a dead animal. Most animals would simply leave it behind. But humans are different. They notice something useful. The animal has a thick layer of skin. That skin can protect the body. So humans begin using animal hides. At first, it probably wasn't anything like modern clothing. No fancy shirts. No perfectly fitting jackets. Just pieces of animal skin wrapped around the body. It wasn't about fashion. It was survival. The hide could help protect against cold. It could protect against wind. It could provide some protection from scratches. And it could even help humans survive in places where their bodies weren't naturally well adapted. But there was a problem. Animal skin isn't automatically comfortable clothing. Fresh hide can be heavy. It can be stiff. It can rot. It can smell terrible. And if humans wanted to use it properly, they needed to learn how to process it. That meant developing tools. And this is where things get really interesting. At some point, humans began making something incredibly useful: needles. Not metal needles like we use today. Early needles were made from things like bone. Imagine taking a small piece of bone, shaping it, and making a tiny hole through it. Now you can pull a thin strip of material through that hole. Suddenly, you can attach pieces of hide together. You can make clothing that actually fits. You can make gloves. You can make shoes. You can make more complicated garments. And that changes everything, because now humans aren't just wrapping themselves in animal skins. They're designing clothing. And that's a huge technological step. Think about it. A needle is tiny. It doesn't look impressive. But with a needle, a human can turn an animal hide into something wearable. And some ancient needles are incredibly old. One of the most famous examples is the Denisovan bone needle, found in Denisova Cave in Siberia, which dates back roughly 50,000 years. That doesn't mean humans suddenly invented clothing 50,000 years ago. It means humans had already developed surprisingly advanced clothing technology by then. And here's the important part. Clothing probably existed long before the oldest surviving needles. Because clothing can disappear, while stone and bone tools can survive. So now we have the big question: why? Why would humans go through all this trouble? Why spend time scraping hides? Why make needles? Why sew pieces together? The obvious answer is cold. And cold is definitely important. Imagine being a human during an ice age. Temperatures drop. The wind hits your body. You have no modern heating. No insulated jacket. No sleeping bag. No central heating. Your body has to produce all the heat itself. And humans aren't particularly well insulated. Compared with many mammals, we're actually pretty strange. We have relatively little body hair. So clothing gives us something our bodies don't naturally have: an extra layer of insulation. But here's the surprising part. Cold probably isn't the entire story. Because humans were wearing clothing in places that weren't always freezing. And there may have been another reason, one that had nothing to do with temperature. Protection. Imagine walking through a forest wearing nothing. Branches scratch you. Thorns cut you. Insects bite you. The sun burns your skin. And you're constantly moving through an environment filled with hazards. A layer of material between your skin and the environment can be extremely useful. So clothing may have been more than a winter jacket. It could have been protective equipment. And then there's another possibility, one that gets even more interesting. What if humans didn't start wearing clothes simply because they were cold? What if clothing also changed the way humans hunted, traveled, survived, and even interacted with each other? Because once humans could cover their bodies, something strange happened. We didn't just gain protection. We gained the ability to change our appearance. And that opens up an entirely different question. Did clothing eventually become more than survival? Did humans start wearing clothes to communicate? To show status? To attract partners? Or even to identify who belonged to their group? That's where the story gets much more interesting. And that's what we'll explore next. So far, we've seen something strange. Humans didn't have fur like bears. They didn't have thick feathers like birds. And they didn't have layers of fat like some Arctic animals. Instead, we had something much more powerful. We could make things. Animal skins could become protection. Bone could become needles. And simple pieces of material could become clothing. But here's the question. Once humans figured out how to cover their bodies, why did they keep improving clothing? Because eventually, clothes stopped being just about staying warm. They became something much bigger. They could tell people who you were. Imagine two groups of humans. One group lives somewhere warm. The other lives somewhere extremely cold. Without clothing, the second group has a serious problem. But now imagine they have animal hides. They can wrap them around their bodies. They can sew them together. They can cover their hands and feet. They can make layers. Suddenly, the cold isn't quite as deadly. And this gives humans something incredibly valuable. Freedom to move into new environments. Humans eventually spread into some of the coldest parts of the planet. They crossed mountains. They moved through icy landscapes. They survived harsh winters. And clothing was probably an important part of that story. But clothing alone wasn't enough. Humans also needed fire, shelter, food, tools, and cooperation. Still, clothing gave them another advantage. It allowed the human body to survive conditions it wasn't naturally designed for. In a way, clothing became our artificial fur. Except humans could change it. Make it thicker. Make it lighter. Make it waterproof. Make it fit better. And eventually, decorate it. Now imagine an ancient human holding two pieces of animal hide. One is plain. The other has a beautiful pattern. Maybe it has feathers attached. Maybe it has colored material. Maybe it has teeth or shells hanging from it. Which one would you choose? Today we might call that fashion. But why would ancient humans care about appearance? Because humans are incredibly social animals. We constantly send signals to each other. Our facial expressions, our voices, our hairstyles, our jewelry, and eventually, our clothes. Clothing can communicate things without saying a single word. It can tell people, I'm part of this group. I'm important. I'm a warrior. I'm wealthy. I'm getting married. I'm different from you. And this may be one reason clothing became so complicated. It wasn't just protecting the body anymore. It was communicating information. Think about modern life. You see someone wearing a police uniform. You immediately know something about them. You see a firefighter. You know their role. You see a doctor wearing medical clothing. You know what they probably do. Now imagine doing something similar thousands of years ago. A person's clothing could tell you what group they belonged to. Maybe they were from another tribe. Maybe they were a hunter. Maybe they were a leader. Maybe they had access to rare materials. And this becomes especially interesting when humans start living in larger communities. Because the bigger the group becomes, the more useful signals become. You can't personally know everyone, so humans develop ways to quickly identify people. Language is one. Symbols are another. And clothing can be one too. But there was another problem. Not every material was easy to get. Imagine a group living near the coast. They find beautiful shells. Another group lives far inland. They might never see those shells. Now imagine someone travels hundreds of kilometers and brings those shells with them. Suddenly the shells become special. They're rare. They're unusual. And someone wearing them might appear important. This is one reason archaeologists get excited when they find ancient beads, shells, pigments, and ornaments, because these objects can tell us something about how humans thought. Humans weren't just surviving. They were thinking about identity, beauty, status, belonging, and clothing could become part of all of that. But here's something fascinating. Clothing doesn't only change how other people see you, it can change how you see yourself. Think about putting on a uniform. You stand differently. You might behave differently. You suddenly feel like you're playing a role. Ancient humans may have experienced something similar. Imagine putting on special clothing before hunting, or wearing decorations during a ceremony, or putting on certain clothing when becoming an adult. The clothing becomes part of the event. It tells everyone, something has changed. And this may help explain why humans became so creative with clothing. We weren't simply protecting skin anymore. We were creating meaning. Now we run into one of the biggest problems with studying ancient clothing. We don't have much of it. Imagine trying to explain modern civilization, but almost every shirt, sock, jacket, and pair of pants disappeared. You'd mostly find bones, buildings, metal objects, plastic, stone, and maybe a few scraps of fabric. That is basically the problem archaeologists face. Clothing is usually made from materials that decay. Skin decomposes. Plants decompose. Fibers disappear. Wood disappears. But stone tools? They can survive for hundreds of thousands of years. So archaeologists often find evidence of humans making tools without finding the clothes those tools helped create. That's why figuring out exactly when humans first started wearing clothes is so difficult. But scientists found a very unusual clue. Lice. Yes, Lisa. Human head lice and clothing lice are related, but they aren't exactly the same. Clothing lice live in clothing and move on to humans to feed. So scientists can study their evolution. And by looking at genetic differences between lice populations, researchers have tried to estimate when clothing lice first appeared. Some studies have suggested that clothing may have been used by humans around 170,000 years ago or earlier, although estimates vary and the evidence doesn't give us an exact date. That's incredible, because it means humans may have been wearing clothes long before written history, long before cities, long before farming, long before pyramids, possibly before humans even left Africa in large numbers. Think about that. Your ancestors may have been wearing some form of clothing, while the world still looked almost completely different from today. But now we have an even bigger question. If humans could survive without clothes for so long, why did our ancestors lose most of their body hair in the first place? Because here's the strange thing. If humans had kept thick body hair like many other mammals, we might never have needed clothing in the first place. So did losing our fur actually force humans to invent clothing? Or did something else happen first? And what does sweating, running, and hunting in the African heat have to do with why humans became relatively hairless? That's where the story gets even stranger. Because before clothing became our artificial fur, our bodies may have been designed for something completely different. So now we have a strange puzzle. Humans started wearing clothes thousands of years ago. But before that, our ancestors had already been evolving for millions of years. And somewhere along that journey, humans lost most of the thick body hair that covers many other mammals. So why? Why did humans become relatively hairless? And could this have something to do with clothing? To understand that, we need to go back to Africa. Imagine an early human walking across a hot landscape. There is no air conditioning, no shade whenever you want it, no cold drink, and the sun is beating down. But this human has something that many other mammals don't have. A very powerful cooling system. Sweating. Humans are actually unusually good at sweating. When your body gets hot, sweat appears on your skin. Then, as that sweat evaporates, it removes heat from your body. It sounds simple, but this ability may have been extremely important in human evolution. Our ancestors could walk and run for long periods in hot environments, and that gave them a very unusual hunting strategy. Instead of trying to catch an animal in a few seconds, humans could keep following it. The animal would run. The human would keep going. The animal would stop to rest. The human would keep going. Eventually, the animal could become dangerously overheated, and the human could still continue. This is sometimes called persistence hunting. Humans were not necessarily the fastest animals. We weren't the strongest. We didn't have claws. We didn't have huge teeth, but we could keep moving. And our ability to cool ourselves through sweating may have helped. Now imagine having a thick layer of fur while doing all of this. That would make cooling your body much harder. So one possibility is that humans gradually became less hairy because being relatively hairless helped with cooling. But there is a problem. Scientists still debate exactly why humans lost their body hair. There isn't one simple answer that everyone agrees on. It could have involved temperature. It could have involved parasites. It could have involved sexual selection. It could have involved several factors working together. And this is important. We shouldn't imagine evolution as a designer sitting down and deciding, humans need less hair. That's not how evolution works. Small differences appear. Some individuals survive or reproduce more successfully. Over enormous periods of time, those differences can become common. And eventually, you get humans who look very different from their ancestors. But now something interesting happens. If humans became less hairy, they became more vulnerable to cold. And that's where clothing becomes incredibly useful. Imagine two problems. Problem number 1. Humans are good at cooling themselves in hot environments. Problem number 2. That same relatively hairless body isn't great at staying warm in cold environments. Clothing gives humans a solution. Instead of growing thick fur, humans can make their own insulation, and unlike fur, clothing can be removed. You're hot? Take it off. You're cold? Put it back on. You're moving somewhere colder? Make it thicker. You're moving somewhere warmer? Make it lighter. That flexibility is incredibly powerful, and humans eventually used it to spread into environments that were very different from the places where our ancestors evolved. Now imagine traveling farther north. The temperature drops. The nights become freezing. The wind becomes brutal. There may be snow and ice everywhere. A human without protection has a serious problem. But a human with fire, shelter, and clothing has a much better chance. And this is where clothing becomes more than something you simply wear. It becomes technology. Think about that. A bird has feathers. A bear has fur. A polar bear has extremely specialized insulation. Humans have something different. We make jackets. We make blankets. We make sleeping bags. We make insulated buildings. We make heating systems. Instead of changing our bodies to fit the environment, we change the environment to fit our bodies. That may be one of the most important things about humans. We don't just adapt biologically, we adapt technologically, and clothing is one of the simplest examples of that. But staying warm wasn't the only challenge. Imagine walking through a forest thousands of years ago. There are sharp branches, thorns, insects, rough plants, and potentially dangerous animals. Your skin is exposed. A layer of material can provide some protection. It can also protect your feet. And that becomes extremely important. Imagine walking barefoot across frozen ground, or sharp rocks, or burning sand, or rough terrain. Your feet take enormous punishment, but once humans learned to wrap materials around their feet, they could travel farther. And eventually, footwear became one of the most useful forms of clothing humans ever created. Shoes don't just keep your feet warm. They protect them. They make difficult terrain easier to cross. And they allow humans to move through environments that would otherwise be painful or dangerous. But there's another reason clothing became so important. It allowed humans to survive environments that changed throughout the year. Imagine an ancient human living somewhere with hot summers and freezing winters. During summer, heavy clothing would be uncomfortable. During winter, being almost naked could be dangerous. So humans could change what they wore depending on the season. And this gave them another advantage: flexibility. You didn't need to evolve thicker fur every winter. You could simply make better clothing. And that meant human technology could change much faster than human biology. Biological evolution takes generations. Technology can change within a lifetime. One generation could discover a better way to sew. Another could develop better shoes. Another could create warmer clothing. And eventually, humans could make clothing from plants, animal fibers, and other materials. This is where the story starts getting even more interesting, because humans didn't stop at animal skins. They started making textiles. They learned to twist fibers. They learned to weave. They learned to dye materials. They learned to create patterns. And eventually, clothing became an entire technology. But there was something else happening at the same time. Humans were becoming more social. Groups were becoming larger. People were communicating more. And clothing could now communicate too. A piece of clothing could tell you where someone came from. It could show their role in society. It could show wealth. It could show membership in a group. And sometimes, it could show that someone had reached a new stage of life. A child could become an adult. A hunter could become a leader. A person could get married. A warrior could return from battle. and clothing could become part of those transformations. So the story of clothing isn't just a story about cold weather. It's a story about survival, technology, human evolution, and eventually, identity. But there's still one huge mystery. If clothing was so useful, why don't we know exactly when humans first started wearing it? Why hasn't archaeology given us the first shirt, the first pair of pants, the first jacket? The answer is frustrating. The oldest clothes are incredibly difficult to find. Most clothing simply disappears. But there are a few places on Earth where something extraordinary happened. Clothing survived. And when archaeologists finally discovered some of these ancient garments, they realized something surprising. Our ancestors weren't just throwing animal skins around their bodies. They were making clothing that was surprisingly sophisticated. And some of it looked much more familiar than you might expect. That's where our story takes us next. So, after everything we've seen, we can finally return to the original question. Why did humans start wearing clothes? The simple answer is survival. But the real answer is much more interesting. Humans evolved in environments where staying cool was important. We became relatively hairless, developed powerful sweating abilities, and became excellent long-distance walkers and runners. But that created a problem. When humans moved into colder environments, our bodies didn't have enough natural insulation. So we created our own. Animal skins became blankets. Hides became coats. Fibers became fabric. And eventually humans learned to sew clothing into shapes that actually fit the body. Clothing became our artificial fur. But humans didn't stop there. Once clothing became useful, it became part of human culture. People began decorating it, using different materials, creating patterns, and wearing different clothes for different occasions. Clothing could tell people who you were, where you came from, what group you belonged to, or what role you had. And that's something that still happens today. Think about a firefighter, a doctor, a soldier, an athlete, a police officer. Before they even say a word, their clothing tells you something about them. That's how powerful clothing became. It started as protection, but eventually became communication. And perhaps the most amazing part is that clothing helped humans live in places our bodies were never naturally designed for. We could move from hot environments to freezing ones. We could cross mountains. We could survive harsh winters. We could travel farther. We didn't need to grow new fur every time the environment changed. We could simply invent something. That's one of the biggest differences between humans and most animals. Animals mainly adapt their bodies to the environment. Humans learn to adapt the environment to themselves. And it all started with something incredibly simple, a piece of material wrapped around the body. So the next time you put on a shirt, jacket, or pair of shoes, remember that you're using technology that has roots stretching back thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands of years. Clothing isn't just fashion. It is one of humanity's oldest survival technologies. And somehow, that simple idea helped a mostly hairless ape spread across an entire planet.